Welcome to the Read-Aloud Revival. This is the show that helps you make meaningful and lasting connections with your kids through books. I am thrilled today to be sharing with you something from the riches inside RAR Premium. Last summer in RAR Premium, which is Read-Aloud Revival's online community that helps you make meaningful and lasting connections with your kids through books and helps homeschool mamas become the peace-filled, joyful mamas they're called to be. Well, in RAR Premium last summer, we read the book On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness. Now, we always have a family book club going at RAR Premium. It's part of what we do there. And these family book clubs help so many families around the world create a simple but rich book club culture in their home. And this was one of my favorites. It was basically a Wingfeather Saga summer. And as part of that, we invited Andrew Peterson to RAR Premium on Zoom to answer kids' questions about the Wingfeather Saga books. Now, we did this event at the start of this summer, so there's no spoilers in this interview. You can listen or continue watching this, even if you haven't read the books yet. I have a feeling you're going to want to read the Wingfeather Saga books once you've heard this. Andrew Peterson is one of my all-time favorite guests. This was not his first time at the Read-Aloud Revival, but this interview was absolutely too good to keep from you. So we've brought it to the Read-Aloud Revival podcast. And if you're watching it on YouTube, go ahead and click subscribe while you're there so that you don't miss a thing that we post to the channel. In today's episode, you're going to hear from Andrew Peterson about his inspiration for writing the Wingfeather Saga, some ridiculous words that he made up that have actually, we've started using them in my own house. Andrew talks about world building in a rich fantasy novel like On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness. He shared his thoughts on storytelling. He tells which stories have impacted his writing the most. And he even told us which Wingfeather character is most like himself. I wonder if you can guess. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Andrew Peterson. We are so glad you're here. We are so excited to be reading On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness this summer.
I am so honored that you chose that book. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh.
It's such a joy.
Well, so this is kind of fun, kids. So, for our fairy tale summer, we're reading On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness. We're also reading classic fairy tales. But my daughter, Allison, who is 20 years old, and she's an art student now, the Wingfeather Saga is her all-time favorite book ever and ever and ever. And she's the one who helped me come up with the plan. I said, wouldn't it be fun to do the Wingfeather Saga this summer? So it's like nothing like a true Wingfeather fan to like craft this whole summer full of Wingfeather goodness. And so I want to know if you have a favorite fairy tale from your own childhood.
Okay, so you mentioned this question earlier. I mean, there's all the obvious ones. There's the Hansel and Gretel and whatever. That one came to mind first because it was scary. I like the fact that a lot of those stories were a little bit creepy. They had this element of like when you grow up and you think about it, you're like, that's a horrifying story. So that got in my imagination, I'm sure, in a good way. Like I enjoy kind of like the delightful shiver of a good scary story. But it wasn't until I was older that I discovered George MacDonald. And so I'm going to pick George MacDonald as his book, The Princess and the Goblin, is a fairy tale that I read to my kids when they were little and has some beautiful nuggets in it that stuck in my mind for a long time. So that's going to be my answer.
And you at Rabbit Room, there are some really great George MacDonald books you guys have re-released, like The Light Princess and is The Princess and the Goblin one of them? I can't remember now.
It was it the print? No, it wasn't the print.
The Golden Key,
graphic novel. Yeah, The Golden Key.
Well, okay.
Yeah, and they're great. And his books are marvelous. There's like a zillion of them. Not all of them are fairy tales, but there's a lot to be learned from George MacDonald. So,
which, of course, like all the authors that I feel like the best writers love, like Tolkien and Lewis, like when I think of Wingfeather, I always think that it feels like it belongs in that family with Narnia and The Lord of the Rings. And then those authors, of course, were influenced by George MacDonald. So that makes sense to me. That it's
for sure. And it's cool to like go back and recognize things in George MacDonald that were subtly added to Lord of the Rings or Narnia or whatever. You find all kinds of little Easter eggs.
Yeah.
And then I did the same thing with the Wingfeather books. I put all kinds of fun little names and stuff that were homages to my favorite writers. So it's cool to be, not like I have to be clear. Like, I don't think I'm nearly the writer of as any of those folks are. But it's fun to kind of be in the same lineage, sort of, just as a person who is a Christian who also really loves a great story and is trying to add more stories to the world is a great privilege.
Okay, so we have a few speed round questions to kick us off. Very important questions, like the most important questions you've ever heard in your life. For example, what is your favorite food?
Oh, wow. My favorite food, Mexican food. I mean, almost anything. We eat Mexican probably 3 nights a week in the Peterson world.
You just had Mexican last night, I think, is what you were just told us.
I did have Mexican last night, and I had it again for lunch today. Yes.
Amazing. That's my favorite kind of food too, so I love it. Okay. Yeah. What about your least favorite food?
Oh, my least favorite food. That's a good question. I don't really have a least favorite food. I like any restaurant you name it, I will find something that I'm interested in.
Okay.
I'm pretty adventurous with food. It's funny, like I do enjoy, I'm not a foodie necessarily, but I really like good food, lovingly made. But I think if I had to pick my favorite genre of food, and Mexican falls into this category, it's like, I usually say this, bougie comfort food. You know what I'm saying? Like if you go to this nice restaurant that's got like shrimp and grits, but it's like fancy shrimp and grits. That's I'm like, I recognize it, but then it's got this little tweak of coolness to it. So at a nice Mexican restaurant, it's like the chimichanga, but it's like a fancy chimichanga. That's what I
okay. So I feel like there should be in Nashville a restaurant that's tagline is good food lovingly made, because that's what you just said. And then when it's like, what kind of food is it? It's bougie comfort food.
Bougie comfort, posh comfort food. I love it.
Yeah. Okay. If you could meet any author or illustrator, past or present, who would it be?
Whoa, good question. Okay, this is a weird answer. Steve Martin. He is
really.
He is not just a. I mean, it's a loose answer because he's written a few books and plays, and he's a screenwriter. So he qualifies as an author. Yeah. But he is also a really great musician. And his book, Born Standing Up, which is his memoir, kind of about his career and how he started out, was really good for me. I loved it. And I'm kind of in this old generation. He's a fascinating person to me. And I just watched the documentary on Apple about him. There's this 2-part documentary, and there's just a lot going on inside that guy. So if I could sit down and have a meal with him and just ask him what he thinks about the world, I would just love to know it, because he was a philosophy major. He interestingly, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but he, in the documentary, they talk about how longing is a core part of Steve Martin's art. And it was so interesting to hear that like it showed all of these movies that he made, and there were these scenes where he was aching for something, but he didn't know what it was. He was longing for love, or he was longing for fulfillment or whatever. And it's like, that's been one of the consistents through the course of his career. And longing, of course, is one of the things that I love about C.S. Lewis. He talks a lot about that. And I
feel like it really permeates your music, actually, that undertone of longing for something.
Yeah. And I think I didn't know it when I was making it, but later I was like, oh yeah, I recognize that DNA is in there. So I would love to have a conversation with Steve Martin and tell him that there is actually an answer to that longing.
Oh, so good. Okay. Oh my goodness. Well, I have his memoir actually in my Kindle loaded up to read. So it's funny that you mentioned this.
It's good.
Like, whoa, kids, you might know him as an actor, or maybe you don't know him as an actor because we're dating ourselves now. But
yeah. I can't say the kids. The answer was for your parents, not for you.
That's right. If you could have a picnic anywhere in the world, where would it be?
Oh wow, that's a good question. I would say Castle Rock, Northern Ireland.
It didn't take you long to get very specific. Tell me more.
Yeah. So Castle Rock is a beautiful little village on the north coast of Ireland that I'm so grateful to have gotten to go there quite a few times. But we stayed there like 10 years ago. A pastor let us use his little place for me and my family to go have a sabbatical. And it wasn't until we got there, very remote, like kind of in the middle of nowhere. And I went on Wikipedia to find out about Castle Rock, and it said, this is the village that C.S. Lewis came to as a boy every summer on holiday when he lived in Northern Ireland. And I was like, that's crazy. So I went down to like the little information center and I was like, is that true? And they were like, yeah, he stayed in that building right there. And this was the beach that he played on. And so just a few miles from there is Cair Paravel. It's called Dunluce Castle. And it was the castle that he said was the inspiration for Cair Paravel. And it looks like it. So there are these beautiful cliff walks. And one of my favorite spots in the world is this cliff walk looking over the train tunnel next to the sea. And there's this building called Mussenden Temple that sits out over the sea. And there's this little perch there that you can sit with your legs kind of dangling over this huge cliff. And the grass there is this really springy, soft grass. And our family, when we stayed there, we called it the bird's nest because it was this little cozy spot that we all found individually. And if I would be on a walk and I would turn a corner and Asher would be sitting in there like, oh, hey, what's up, Pops? Sitting in there, seagulls flying everywhere, cliff, the whole thing. So that I wrote several chunks of The Warden and the Wolf King, the fourth Wingfeather book, sitting in the bird's nest there. And so it's one of the most magical places in the world to me. And so if I could just zap and have a picnic with my wife and family, that's where we'd go.
Oh, so good. Okay, let's see. Here's our good one. In your opinion, what's the funniest word in the English language?
Oh, wow. Well, here's one. This is a bad answer, but I make up words all the time. And it's this goofy thing that I don't think I realized I did until I had friends point out how dumb it was. And so I have these goofy words. So like, I used to nicknamed my kids all these nonsense names when they were little. And so Aiden was Chonus Ponus. I just called him Chonus Ponus. And that got shortened to the Chone. And so I'm trying to think what else.
Can we call him the Chone when he comes to Read-Aloud Revival?
Yeah, ask him if he remembers that. And I can't wait to know his reaction. But Asher was Tinky Tinky Tie, which was also dumb, but that got shortened to Tink, which is where I got Tink for the Wingfeather Saga.
Oh, amazing. Okay.
And then Sky's nickname was Lily Bobo. And I called her Lily Bobo all the time, so that got shortened to Lily. I still call her Lily a lot of times because that came first, and then I named Lily in the books after that. Okay. But my new favorite word, this is so embarrassing, I can't believe I'm telling you this, but Trond, Trond, has become my like place filler word for anything. So if I can't think of something,
mean something, or did you make it up?
It means whatever you want it to mean. So it's like, for example, I'll be like trying to talk to Jamie about, hey, we need to drop the car off at the shop, but I can't think of the words. I'll be like, we need to Trond the car, and she knows what I mean. And so I can't believe I'm telling you this.
Okay, but yeah, this is not an actual English language word. You made it up, built in.
No, exactly. Like Trond is a word that just fits for everything. I was like, oh, are you tronding today? Or what's the Trond happening with the, and it's just like for when you're trying to think of a word and you don't really need the word, everybody knows what you're talking about. Yeah. Trond is this filler word. So my hope is that because of all of your astute readers, that they'll begin to use Trond as a filler word, and that in 50 years we'll see it in the OED. There it'll be.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. So there's one addendum to that is the word plotus, Plotus. And you can use Trond the Plotus. So like sometimes they'll be like, hey, are we going to Trond the Plotus later today? And it could mean, are we going to go to the store? Or it could mean, are we going to clear the dishes before we watch the movie? Are we going to Trond the Plotus? And Plotus can be, pluralized to Ploti. Have we Tronded the Ploti? It actually made its way into the Wingfeather animated series. There's a scene where Cal is trying to plot with Oscar how to like get their parents out of jail. And he was like, yeah, remember in that one book where they Tronded the Plotus? So I slipped that into the Wingfeather series. So there you go. That's the dumbest
thing. I had no idea this was going to open such a can of worms. Amazing. I feel like here's another like Tolkien-ish thread because Tolkien likes to make up words. I see.
His were way cooler though. Yeah.
I don't know. Tronding the Plotus is pretty amazing, actually. Okay, let's start talking about your books because we have some questions from a ton of kids who want to know how you got the idea or initial inspiration for On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness.
Sure. So there are a lot of ways to answer that question. One of them is the Narnia books. It was reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to my kids when they were little. And one of the reasons I love what you guys do is that read-alouds were a big part of our family life. I loved to read aloud to my kids. And I'll just say this. I was just talking to a dad the other day who was telling me he was reading On the Edge to his kids. And I always ask the kids, do the parents do good voices? Like, it's important. Are they doing good voices? But anyway, he was telling me that how much they as a family loved to read aloud. And I was like, just soak it up, because there was a last read aloud with our kids. And I didn't know it. You know what I mean? You don't know it when it's happening. But you look back and you're like, whoa, we haven't done that because our kids are all grown and married. And there was the last book that we read. And it's pretty bittersweet to think about it. And so I'm very grateful to have a granddaughter and look forward to.
I was going to say, now you have a whole nother generation coming up.
I was going to say a few years from now, I'm already reading little board books to her. So reading the Narnia books to the kids when they were old enough was the thing that made me decide to stop talking about writing a novel and really try to do it. Like, I'd wanted to write books since I was in high school, and music took over. And, I'd tried to write books, but I didn't have the self-discipline or the stamina to keep it up.
Yes.
So it wasn't until I had made a few records and had been touring and grew up a little bit and understood that art is work, and that if you want to get to the satisfaction of having written a book, you've got to put a lot of work in. And that's otherwise you'll just have a bunch of false starts and you'll never have known what it was like to write the end. And that's the thing that's like, it isn't a book until you get to the end, And so I learned that lesson. And so it was reading the Narnia books and just wanting to try to craft a story that would get inside the imagination of kids was part of the inspiration. I mean, I loved the Harry Potter books. I was reading the Harry Potter books while they were coming out. I got in on it at like book 3.
Yes.
And so was a part of, like, I was in line, to get book 5 and 6 or whatever. And so I loved the combination of whimsy, like silly words like Hogwarts and Dumbledore, only it's got this undercurrent of epic stakes and serious story. And so I really loved that. So when I was writing the Wingfeather Saga, I wanted there to be a little bit of the whimsy, but I wanted the reader to kind of sense by the end of book 1, oh, there's a lot more going on here than just a light little kid story, right?
Yes.
I wanted the bottom to kind of drop out and this to be a big epic thing. So that was part of the inspiration. And then 2 more quick things I would say. Did you ever listen to A Prairie Home Companion with Garrison Keillor? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I never did.
Okay. It was great. We used to listen to it on the road, and every week he would tell a story, the news from Lake Wobegon. So some of the parents out there may remember this. But it's this radio show, and he had this fictional town in Minnesota, and he would every week on his radio show make up a 10-minute story about something that happened in the town. And one of those stories was called The Royal Family. And he imagined in this Minnesota town that there was this single mom with her kids, and she was poor. And one day she gets a letter in the mail that the father of her children was the heir to the Scottish throne. And but they couldn't tell anyone because they needed to be very careful with the politics. And so he was like, we need to reveal this at the right moment, who the King of Scotland it really is. And who knew that it was one of these kids growing up in Lake Wobegon, Minnesota. And I heard that story. And in that story, there was something really cool about, I'm trying not to spoil anything here, something really cool about the way the kids carried themselves differently once they knew the truth, right? And so I thought, what if there was a family where the kids came to discover that they weren't who they thought they were, and that there was more going on around them than there was. So that was it. And then the third thing I would say is the Bible, honestly. And I don't mean that in a, like, I guess I could mean it in a Sunday school way, but like, I didn't grow up with a classical education at all. I was not a super great student. I loved to read, but I my head was in the clouds and I was always looking out the window. But when I was reading about C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and some of the Inklings and writers that we love who grew up 100 years ago, who grew up, and they were classically educated. So they're reading the Iliad and they're reading whatever, all the stuff, all the
Not
really
the
great
Babysitter's
works.
Club, which was what I was reading. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
And so I was like a little jealous when I was listening to them, reading about them and how much
Yeah.
those stories informed their writing.
Mm-hmm.
But then I realized that because I grew up in the church, I did have another piece of classical literature that I was always reading as a kid.
Yes.
And
Yes.
epic stories, ancient literature, poetry, high adventure, prophecy. I had to kind of change my thinking and realize that whether you're a Christian or not, the Bible is this incredible work of literature. And those stories were undeniably a big influence on the Wingfeather Saga.
Yeah. You just mentioned that you were not a great student. I was just at a conference this last weekend where somebody asked during one of my sessions a question that made me remember the story that I've heard you say. I can't remember if you told me like over dinner or something, or if I heard you say it at something else. I don't know. About how that your mom was really worried about you. You had like overheard a phone conversation where she was worried about you always like fiddling around on your guitar or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And I just think to myself, like as parents, and I know there's lots of parents watching today, we have like this like really strong desire and drive to make sure our kids are prepared for what they need, but actually only God knows what they need for their next stage. It's just, I don't know, that image always comes to mind for me because of course the lives that you impact and change and transform actually through your writing and your music probably required all of that fiddling around on your guitar.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. I remember it was a letter that I found after I was grown up.
Oh, okay. I
And
changed it. It was a phone call.
My mom was writing to my brother when he was a Marine, and she said, "Yeah, I'm worried about Andrew. He's going to turn out to be a do flunky, just like his cousin." And I asked my mom, I was like, "First of all, what's a do flunky? I've never heard this word before."
It's related to a plotus.
Yeah, exactly. She was making up words too. I was like, "What did you mean by that?" And she was like, "Well, you weren't, studying or anything. You were just kind of playing your guitar and drawing your pictures and, writing your stories and stuff." And it was like, I get it. But it was, once I became a follower of Jesus, those things suddenly took on life. And they were something that I was like, oh, there's a purpose and there's this meaning. And I want to use those things for something other than my own self. And that put gas in the engine and made me really, really want to do it. But yeah, all that stuff that seems like a waste of time can end up being, maybe it's a gift, It also can be a waste of time. But we don't know that. You can't know. So our approach was always to just fan the flame of the interest and to speak into the gifting as we saw it. If we saw a gifting in our kid, we would lean in and kind of name it and say, "Do you know that you're really good at this thing?" Because a lot of times we don't know. We're too close to the painting to see what it is. So we don't know our own gifting very well. So we need our community to help us see it.
A bazillion kids, approximately, want to know how long it took for you to write On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness. Do you remember?
Yeah, it was from the time I sat down and really started writing in earnest until the time I went to Barnes & Noble and saw it on the shelf was 5 years. Okay. So yeah, it was about 5 years. So that meant, that took the longest to write. Book one took the longest to write because it was my first novel. There's a lot to learn in the process of writing, and went through many edits and a lot of world building, and a lot of maps were drawn, a lot of back histories were written, a lot of paring away to figure out what the story really was, and then my editor just tore it up when I sent it to her, and I'm so grateful that she did. Like,
as the best editors usually do, right?
Yeah, like it hurt bad for the first 10 pages, and after that, I loved it. I was like, please keep helping me grow as a writer. Keep helping this book get better, because it's way more important than my feelings is the thing we're making. And so lots of edits, and then of course it took a long time to get it copy edited. And I mean, there's a long process, but I was noodling with it a lot for about 5 years.
Okay. Betty, who's 11, wants to know which book in the series was the most fun to write.
Ooh, book 3 was the most fun to write. Yeah. Okay. But so book 1 was very difficult because it was my first. Book 2 is very difficult because, you have to remember I was touring constantly as a musician while I was writing these books. So it was 2 full-time jobs at once. And so it was, writing chapters on the tour bus before sound check, and then doing the whole concert and then coming back on and staying up to finish writing that chapter, just under a lot of pressure.
And you're a father. I mean, I know you're touring, but like, and you're, yeah, there's all that.
For sure. And it was tied in together because it's like part of that motivation was, well, there's a mortgage to pay and diapers and all that stuff. So it's like trying to make this thing work. And so book 2 was written in about a year and a half because there was no time. It was just my publisher was like, we got to get book 2 out soon. And so I had to write that. So that one was written frantically. And I think you can tell when you're reading the book, those of you who have read book 2 is basically one long chase scene. It's like, it comes out of the gate and they're on the run the whole time. So by the time I got to book 3, and I'm not going to spoil anything, the family has found a place where they think they're going to find some real peace. And I just got to let them be still for a little while and explore this new place where they found themselves with the Durgan Guild and the schooling and the Green Hollows and stuff. And it was really fun. Like I just loved getting to know them better in that world. So yeah, book 3 was but book 4 is my favorite of the books. But that one,
book 4 is my favorite just because of what it is. But I think I hear most often from young readers. I know my daughter, I know one of our team members will say book 3 is their favorite. And I think that's so interesting that also you were having the most fun writing it. I wonder, there's got to be it.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah. Wyatt, who's 8, and Tally, who's also 8, they want to know what was the hardest part of writing On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness.
The most difficult part of writing On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness. I think it was similar to the animated series. The first book of a series that's set in a new world. It's really hard to know how to gracefully convey to the reader, how to know how much the reader needs to know.
Okay.
I was drawing toothy cows and horned hounds and had maps and had all the funny names and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of the world building that you do doesn't need to show up exactly in the story. It's for you to know, right? Mm-hmm. And so, the example I always use when I talk to students about this is that it was early on in the book, maybe chapter 2 or 3, where I went, when the kids are going to the Dragon Day Festival at the beginning of On the Edge. And I realized that I didn't know how they were supposed to pay for their blueberry gooey balls or whatever.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, money. How does money work in Air? And so I had to figure out, do they use coins or jewels or beads? Like, how do you pay for stuff? And not knowing what kind of coins, so if they are coins, then that means that there's a coin press somewhere.
Yeah.
That means, which makes you go, okay, what kind of technology do they have access to? I remember Jonathan Rogers, who wrote The Wilder King. He was one of the early readers of it. Okay. And there's a scene where Janner strikes a match. And he wrote a little note in the margin that said, do they have gunpowder? Because the same stuff that they used for matches is what they would have used to shoot. So I was like, that raises all these questions. I don't want there to be guns in the Wingfeather world, but I do want there to be matches. How does that work? So those are just examples of all of the little picky little things that you have to know going into the story. And then you have to decide how much of this does the reader need to know, and how much do they just intuit? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You as the author need to know those answers. So that was very difficult. So once you've finished building the world and you've got the characters developed and you've got that first book out of the way, book 2 felt like a party because I wasn't having to think about world building. I was just having to think about storytelling.
Jonathan Rogers, who you just mentioned, kids, I just want to put a bug in your ear that we are reading The Bark of the Bog Owl and his whole Wilder King trilogy this coming winter in RAR Premium.
Awesome.
So you have that to look forward to because they just came out with new covers. This kind of ties into a question from a lot of our young aspiring authors who are here who want to know, what should you consider when creating a world for your story? Do you begin with the world building? Do you work from outlines? How does, in the case of the match, it's kind of like you figure it out as you go along because something comes up. Tell me a little more about that.
Yeah, I think that, yes, it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of an idea of the kind of story you want to tell, but you're going to run into problems quickly if you haven't built the world first, if you're writing fantasy. Just like if you were writing a historical fiction set during the Civil War, you need to know about how people lived back then in order to write anything, right? So you have to do your research. So with a fantasy novel, research, quote unquote, is world building. I think that is very important, in my opinion, to start with a map and fill in all the rivers and geographical features, and then name cities, and then begin to populate those forests with creatures and figure out, in one of the writing workshops I did years ago, I was trying to get the young people to trying to get their imaginations to broaden a little bit about what it means to write fantasy. And I was just kind of like, okay, so if it's a fantasy world and you're the author, you get to decide everything. You get to decide all the rules. And so the kids, we had a whiteboard and we were trying to figure out, okay, what are the rules in this world? And by the end of it, we had come up with a planet that takes like 1,000 years to rotate, so that it's 10 generations or however many generations of people before night comes.
Oh, wow.
And so the idea of there being this 1,000-year night that some people have survived, that they've only heard rumors about, things like that. Like, so like you get to decide all of that stuff. Like a day doesn't have to be the same as a day in our world,
Yes.
which drifts into sci-fi a little bit. But the point is, it was like that feeling of freedom of, well, I can give the cows fangs, I can make them carnivores in my world, was really fun. And I think it's really important to do that work. And then the story grows out of that. So, and I was saying earlier about reading the Bible, it was every time I had some revelation, like, you start with a map and then the characters grow out of the map like flowers in a garden. And then you read Genesis and it starts with a map. It starts with,
that's right. Yes.
continents and, a garden. And then, why don't we put a person here? And let's see what happens when we put these two what happens when we put some conflict into this story and it unfolds. And so there's a lot to be learned from the original sources,
Amazing. Okay, let's see. Let's look at some more questions from the kids. This is a popular question. I don't know if you're gonna be able to answer it, especially since you told us a little bit about how you came up with the kids' names, but do you have a favorite character from the book?
Ooh, I don't have a favorite character. It depends on what I have for breakfast.
Okay.
It's just like, it changes all the time. I mean, it's funny because the animated series has gotten muddled in my mind. They're all living in the same world,
Mm-hmm.
and to have been a part of the show means that I get to help make the characters in the show like I imagine them in the books.
Yeah.
So they've all kind of like morphed into one thing. But Pete the Sockman consistently comes to mind as a character that I guess I'm proud of. I don't know. Like I really like the complexity of his character. When I first wrote the character, I didn't know why he had socks on his hands.
Oh, okay. You had to discover that yourself.
Yeah, I just literally wrote down Pete the Sockman because I thought that was a funny name for a character, and then had to do the quote unquote research and build the world a little bit and figure out what. Okay, anytime you're writing a fantasy like that, start with the whimsy, start with something fun, let your imagination play. And then after you've kind of said, okay, his name is going to be Pete the Sockman, then figure out why.
Okay.
And same thing happened with Nag the Nameless, the big villain. I was like, okay, Nag the Nameless is a pretty funny name for a villain.
It's so funny. I mean, it's a really funny name.
Yeah. And he was a nameless evil who had no name. His name was Nag the Nameless. And so I just thought that was funny. But then, of course, you can't just stop there. Like, I wanted the story to feel real. And so I had to, there's a bunch of documents on my old, computer that were the history of RAR, and one of them is Nag the Nameless, and I had to figure out why his name is that. And I don't tell anybody that until the end of book 4. Nobody really knows, but Pete the Sockman was that way. And so once I realized, that's why he's wearing socks on his hands, it opened up his character and a whole bunch of the story. I was able to understand a lot more of what was going on.
My favorite character is Oscar Reteep because...
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for that.
Just the absolute best quotes that make me like wheeze laughing while I'm reading it aloud, because it's like, as Oscar Reteep. Yeah. I mean, when he quotes when he quotes and they're just like the most benign
non sequiturs. Yeah.
So funny. So funny.
It's ridiculous. Yes. I have a little too much fun with that. And I resisted being his voice in the show, but it's secretly been really fun to do. So yeah, it's pretty fun.
I bet. Eden is 10, and if you can answer this question without spoiling anything, I think you probably could. We'll see. She wants to know, where did the idea of the black carriage come from?
Ooh, I honestly don't remember where the idea for it came from, but I do remember that, in the world, I imagine that the Fangs were these terrible, occupying evil army that would sometimes stop outside your house and kidnap you. And I've since gotten emails from people who live in parts of the world where that actually happens. And it has been sobering to realize that like there are people who are reading these stories and they're finding resonance with things that I think of as crazy fantasy, that actually the world is very broken and these things happen, right? But yeah, the black carriage was a part of the world. But I remember my editor said, she was like, I just feel like we really need to open with some kind of danger to hook the reader. And she's like, what if the first scene was not just Janner kind of like doing his chores? What if the first scene was Janner trying to get to sleep because he could hear the carriage? And that led to the poem and led to actually Sarah Cobbler. I just picked a random name. Well, you guys don't know Sarah Cobbler yet. She shows up later, but her name is mentioned in chapter 1. And she became one of my favorite characters just because of that idea of, well, let's bring the black carriage to the beginning of the story. And it also serves a good purpose because it's pretty scary. Like the black carriage, the poem, and the idea of it is a scary idea. And
it is.
It's a good way of telling parents like, hey, if this first chapter is not for you, then maybe the kids need to grow up a little bit before you read your books. Yeah.
Yes. It's a good, like, this is what you're signing up for. You ready? Let's go. Sarah, who's 17, asks if you had a message that you hope people get from reading the series or not.
It's a good question. I don't have a message that I want people to get from it. I have hopes that God will use the story in certain ways, but I wouldn't call it a message. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'm not trying to be evasive. One of the cool things about art is that it does more than you think it can, right? Even as the artist, like whether it's you're writing songs or books, that I think that it can hobble the story a little bit if you put too much of your own expectation on what the thing is supposed to do. So my job as an author and as a songwriter is to try to tell the truth as beautifully as I can, and then release it to the world with high hopes about what the Lord is going to do with it and what it might do in the heart of the reader. But as soon as I start like defining what that is, then I'm just signing up for trouble. Yes. That's the thing is you want to like participate with God in the making of the thing. He kind of like invites us into this process, which is a great privilege. But then, as Flannery O'Connor said something about how once I've written my story and it goes out into the world, what it does is God's business and not mine. Yes. And so she was pretty hardcore. And so I love that about her. But I do get that idea. Like, I think that I would hope that my books pique an ache. And because the best art that I've encountered does that for me, it stirs an ache and a longing in me. And then the amazing thing is to sit back and watch what God does with that longing. Yeah.
And in ways probably you can't even imagine, you kind of said that before, that you're surprised sometimes when people tell you about the impact your book had on them. Yes. If you are trying to wrap it up in a message, you'd probably actually keep it from being able to reach people in all the different ways it needs to. I don't know.
Yeah. So if you sit down to write your story and you're thinking, here is the message I want to convey. Yeah. It's going to make it really difficult, and it might make the story harder to read. Yeah. So instead, sit down and ask yourself, how can I tell the very best story I can tell, and let the story do its thing, and trust that it's going to do what it needs to do in the reader.
Especially when you have like yourself, like you were talking about how you were formed by scripture, and all these young writers who are here with us today are formed likely by scripture and by classic stories like Narnia, like The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, the Wingfeather Saga. You have all of these epic tales that are true and hopeful inside of you, and those cannot help but like come out in your storytelling.
Yeah. And so if you're a student of storytelling, and like become a student of how stories work and what they're doing, so that you can not so that you can cage the animal, but so that you can unlock the cage. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like you don't want to like trap it and say, here's what I want the story to do. You want to say, oh, I'm gonna make a story and then just set it loose on the world and let it become this amazing thing. And so that doesn't mean that you don't get to bring what you believe to the story. There are certain things that show up in the books. In book 2, there's a moment where Poto says to the kids, don't just follow your heart will betray you. Yeah. And that I put that in there. I was very intent that made it into the TV show too, because I wanted a counter narrative to so much of what is out there. You know, there's so many follow your heart stories, and it's like, well, that's trouble.
Yeah.
And so there are moments in the story where I tried really hard to like let the character be the kind of character who would say that kind of thing. So it doesn't mean that you don't get to put what you believe to be true into the story, but you can't do that. You can't get the thing out of order. You got to let the story be the story first.
So good. So good. You told us about Narnia, but Lainey, who's 7, Fiona, who's 9, Mary, who's 12, all want to know, are there any books, old stories, or fables you grew up reading that inspired or spoke into Wingfeather?
Yes. I loved the book The Black Stallion when I was a kid. I don't know if you ever read The Black Stallion, but it's so good. It's got this, big chunk of the book happens in Arabia, and it's this boy and his horse, and there's just high adventure, sand dunes, and the whole thing. I loved that book. And I loved Lloyd Alexander's The Prydain Chronicles.
Oh, yeah.
Remember those? And
I never read them, but my Allison, who is the one who loves your book so much that she would name them as one of her favorites. Good. Yeah.
They're so good. Yeah, yeah. And they do that thing where it starts off as kind of like a fun little, adventure fantasy story that ends up by the end having these big epic stakes. And I just remember vividly reading the 5th book in the Prydain Chronicles as a boy and burning through it. Like my eyes were all dry from, just I couldn't stop reading. So I'm trying to think what else. I didn't read Lord of the Rings until I was in high school. And in between, it was just a bunch of mostly empty fantasy. I just kind of burned anything with a dragon in it and a sword. I was burning through it, reading it. And it wasn't until I got a little older that I began to realize how much I was missing in literature,
Yes.
I remember sitting in my senior English class and we were reading The Old Man and the Sea, and which is an amazing story. Not
for a high schooler, probably.
Maybe not, right. And okay. But I remember, there's all this symbolism in that book. At the end of that book, the old man is carrying the mast of the ship on his shoulder. Yes. And it's a pretty, now I see, obvious symbol of someone carrying their cross, right? Oh, and so there's all these ways to read into the literary, the depth of this book. And I remember being in high school being like, that is so dumb, raising my hand and just thinking, there's no way that could represent a person carrying his cross. It's a mast on a ship. And so, but just being this smart aleck who didn't really get what was going on. And now that I'm older, I realize that I've missed out on a lot of great literature. So I've gone back and tried to read some of the fantasy I loved when I was a kid, and I've kind of lost my taste for it.
Okay.
Which is part of why I wanted to write the Wingfeather books, is because I just, I wanted to add to the kind of fantasy that I missed. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's got to be more to it than just dragons and swords. There's got to be good sentences, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Like, prose, beautiful, I just remembered another book, The Eagle of the Ninth. Have you heard of this book by Rosemary Sutcliffe?
Yes, but I have not read anything by her, actually.
Oh, I just read it a few years ago because a friend of mine and I walked Hadrian's Wall in England. And the book is set in Roman England in 2,000 years ago. And it was a wonderful book. That kind of stuff. I missed it. Because if it didn't have a dragon, I wasn't interested. But I was like, oh man, there's so many good things out there to read.
Okay. Which character is most like you? That's what a lot of kids want to know.
Oh, wow. I mean, there's little bits of me in all of them, even in Nag the Nameless. But I think I identify a lot with Janner and his selfishness. Sorry, that's a spoiler. But I didn't realize until I got to the end of book 4. I don't think I realized. I didn't really realize to the gravity that it shows itself to be.
I think that's a spoiler because I don't think we'll know. Like we don't know the depth of it until we keep reading.
Yeah. So Janner's central flaw, I think, is selfishness.
Okay.
And when I got to the end of book 4, I realized that, and I was like, oh wow, that explains his decision making along the way.
Yeah, and, it does. Yep.
And it also explains how he needs to overcome that in his story, And so I do feel a lot of that, like I've had to fight that from the time I was little. I think just realizing there's a lot more going on than just what's going on in here. And And so I think I resonate with Janner, but all of them. I could say something like that about all of them.
Yeah. Okay. I know we're like down to minutes, so I'm going to ask you like a couple super speedy ones. One is Zoe, from Zoe, who's 10, Judah, who's 9, Marie, who's 11. They want to know what you enjoy writing more, books or songs?
Books. Yeah. I really love songwriting, but books, I like feeling like a kid. So.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite song that you've written? That's what Jack wants to know.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. If I had to name one, I would say a song called "Don't You Want to Thank Someone."
I love that song. Yes.
Thank you. I love to sing.
My favorite is He Worthy? That's my favorite, but that one's the one that I play on replay. It's like, and if I tell Spotify play Andrew Peterson, it plays it first because it knows that's the one I want to hear.
Amazing. Thank you.
I do tell my phone to play that a lot. Let's see. Okay, last question, and then I want to ask you really briefly about the animated series. This comes from Levi, who's 10, Emmeline, who's 12, and Abigail, who's 14. They want to know if you're working on a new book right now, or do you have any plans to in the future? Is there anything you can tell us about projects?
Yes, I am 3 years late on a new book that is back during COVID. I signed a 2-book deal with B&H to write one memoir and one young adult adventure story that was just not a Wingfeather book, but just a standalone young adult story. And I said yes because I couldn't tour during COVID. I was stuck at home. And so I was like, I guess I better have some work. So I signed this deal and I wrote The God of the Garden was the memoir.
Yes.
And then by the time I finished God of the Garden, the world opened back up and I was back out on the road and the Wingfeather TV show took off and all these things got busy. And I'm 3 years late on turning in this other book. So I have started it and I'm hoping to make some real headway this summer.
We cannot wait. Right, kids? I think I can speak for all of us.
But I love Kate DiCamillo and Catherine Patterson and those kind of Bridge to Terabithia type stories. So I'm going to try to write something along those lines, but I might actually just fail at it and write something with dragons and swords. I'm not sure yet.
We'll see what it decides to be.
We'll see what happens.
Yeah. So the Wingfeather Saga has been turned into an animated series. You've had a very close hand in all of the making of that, I believe. Remind me where we can watch that. Where kids can watch that right now.
If you go to angel.com, Angel Studios. Yeah.
Okay.
In season 1, I'm pretty sure you can watch for free. And season 2, if you're a guild member, if you join their website, you can watch it. It'll be free later. But yeah, and then season 3 is on hold while we gather funding, but it is just the coolest thing. I can't even believe it. Like we've got the most amazing team. Like our art director left Pixar to come work with us, and Chris Wall was at DreamWorks. He's the showrunner, and I get to be involved in it. Just these amazing team of people making this show, and they love the story. I wish you could see Chris's personal copy of the Wingfeather Saga, all 4 books that are 1,000 little tags and notes written. So like it is like the handbook that the team is using to make these stories because they really want the series to be true to the spirit of the book. So it's been a great joy to do, and it's going to be 7 seasons, Lord willing. So we're in it for the long haul. It's pretty great, and I get to do Oscar Nosrutip and occasionally a Fang of Dang. So it's pretty fun.
I love it so much. And what a treat really for the animation team to love your story as much as you do, because then you feel like it's in good hands, I'm sure.
It is definitely in good hands. It's really amazing. And we had the cast is amazing too. Like the Billy Boyd, who played Pippin in the Lord of the Rings movies. He's the overseer in book 2. And so there's all these like kind of big name actors that are, if you had told 20 years ago, Andrew, that these people were going to be acting and saying these lines. The crazy thing is I find myself sometimes in the studio, like correcting them. And I'm like being like, oh yeah, deliver the line like this. And I think
this is how you should say Tronge the Plotus, for example.
Exactly. So it's just this crazy experience that the book 1 and season 1 line up, and season 2 is half of book 2. And so it's kind of broken up like that. But yeah, we love getting to do that.
Andrew,
Oh, goodness.
we're so excited to read this book and all the books, to really dive into Wingfeather, or to go back into Wingfeather if we've read it before. Thank you so much for taking the time to kick off our summer with us, to chat with us. We just love the work you're doing, and we're grateful for it. So thank you.
Thank you so much. You guys are amazing. I'm blown away by the comments. I'm trying to read them as they go by. So just thank you, everybody. I can't tell you what a dream come true it is to have written a book that has resonated with you. And so I love it. It's one of the greatest things in my life. I can't believe it. Can I just say to you, thank you for what you do. Like, it really is. I've just been such a big fan of Read-Aloud Revival over the years, and cheering you on from afar. I know we don't get to talk all the time, but I just think it's marvelous. So
thanks
for
so much.
letting me be a little part of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Pretty fabulous, right? Listen, every single month, all year long, kids at RAR Premium get to meet authors and illustrators just like this in Zoom, and you can be a part of it. When kids meet their favorite authors and illustrators like this, and they get to ask their questions, they begin to see them and their books in a new way. You'll notice your kids will see other books by that author or illustrator at the library or at the bookstore, and they'll feel like, oh, I know him or I know her, right? It just enriches your family's love of reading and love of books in such a profound way. You can join us in RAR Premium anytime. To get in on the fun, go to rarpremium.com. Show notes for this episode are at readaloudrevival.com/wingfeather. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. In the meantime, you know what to do. Go make meaningful and lasting connections with your kids through books.